Hello, this is Simon Eggington from Medtronic in Switzerland, and on behalf of my co-authors who are listed there on the slide, I'm going to present today on the topic of medical device characteristics in health technology assessment, with a particular focus on methods guidance for HTA of devices and the practical application of this guidance. I'll talk you through a study that we've recently completed and hopefully provide some suggestions for what we think needs to happen next to address some of the findings. I'll start with a bit of background just by explaining what I mean by some of the unique characteristics of devices and procedures and how those differentiate these products from pharmaceuticals within HTA. And the four characteristics that I'm about to explain here are taken from the MedTech HTA project from several years ago. Firstly, learning curve. So this relates to the skill and experience of the implanting surgeon or the operator of the device, the implanter generally. And that's, of course, related to procedure volume and familiarity with a particular device. And this is important because clinical studies that are undertaken with surgeons who are perhaps unfamiliar with a new device, those studies might produce results that lead to higher complication rates, longer procedure times, and patient length of stay, and potentially just worse outcomes in general for patients. But over time, as surgeons gain more experience with the device, we would expect these initial effects to improve, and so probably better patient outcomes as the surgeon gains more experience, and potentially lower costs through shorter procedure times and reduced adverse event rates. The second characteristic is incremental innovation, and many devices get upgraded over time with new features, and this may include battery longevity, a reduced device size, therefore making it easier to implant, and also things like compatibility with MRI. So over time, we might expect a product to have a better cost effectiveness profile as these features get incorporated. So if an HTA is done on an early version of the device, it may look less cost effective than with a version of the device that's issued later with some of these better features. Third aspect is dynamic pricing. Now, unlike pharmaceuticals, there's no patent for devices. And so competitors can enter the market quickly. That pushes down prices. And another effect is that tendering and general procurement of devices is quite different. And this can also lead to quite big fluctuations in device prices over time. The final characteristic is organizational impact. This one relates to the need for hospitals or implanting centers to make other investments or adaptations in order to use the new device. As an example, this could include establishing and training multidisciplinary teams, or potentially even buying new capital equipment or creating specialist facilities to be able to use the device. So those are the characteristics that we're interested in looking at. And I'll just briefly explain what our objective and research question were. So given the expected importance of these characteristics in HTA, and in particular in economic evaluation, we set out to determine the extent to which medical device characteristics, so the four I just listed, are routinely assessed by HTA agencies and incorporated in their guidelines and reports. Moving on to the methods. So there were three main components to our research. Firstly, we looked at methods guidelines issued by 14 different HTA agencies from around the world, as well as from 5 HTA networks. And this was to understand if device-specific characteristics were mentioned within their methods guidance. We then reviewed product-specific reports from these HTA agencies based on a short list of 16 different medical devices covering different disease areas. And the goal of this part of the work was to see if the 4 criteria, learning curve and so on, were assessed in the HTA in any way, either in the clinical section or in any economic analysis that was undertaken. Thirdly, we conducted a narrative literature review to identify any related research and describe any of the proposed methods put forward by other researchers. And just to give you a quick overview of the HTA bodies that we reviewed, these are the 14 country agencies that we looked at. I won't list them all, but they covered Europe, North America, Latin America, and Asia Pacific. Then there are also 5 HTA networks or other organizations that we looked at, and which issued their own guidance on HTA methods. Moving on to the results. So that first piece of the work, well, of the 14 country HTA bodies, all but one have either generic or device-specific methods guidelines that lay out how their processes work and how they carry out economic evaluations and so on. And many of these do mention at least some of the 4 characteristics that we described before, although not in much detail. Second part of the results. So when we looked at the HTA reports issued by these agencies for the 16 selected devices, many of them did mention some of those criteria, but none of them really attempted to formally include them in the HTA or in any economic analysis. So they were mentioned rather than addressed as such. Finally, in the literature review, we identified 10 relevant studies, and the common theme running through all of these was a lack of robust methodological guidance for economic evaluation and HTA in general of devices. But just to go into a bit more detail about our main findings and try and put these into context, well, most HTA agencies do have some guidelines specific to medical devices, so this is progress. And although some of those guidelines mention the device-specific criteria, the 4 criteria characteristics, they all lack any detail in terms of how to incorporate those characteristics into HTA activities, and in particular into economic evaluation. Our review of the recent HTA reports of specific devices is a logical follow-on from that, I think. The guidance is lacking, and therefore the HTA reports issued by the agencies don't really address issues such as learning curve, dynamic pricing, and so on. Other studies that we identified in the literature describe some of these issues, but again, there's a lack of methodological solutions to these issues. So our final slide is really a call to action, I think. And so based on our research, we think there are several points that need to be addressed by the HTA community. Firstly, we need to raise awareness of the importance of these device-specific characteristics within HTA agencies. Secondly, there's a need for formal standardized methods for incorporating these characteristics in HTA, and in particular within economic evaluation. We need further research into making better use of real-world data to support HTA of medical devices. And finally, the gaps highlighted can lead to inadequate evaluation of devices, and that has a knock-on effect in terms of suboptimal use of resources and patient access to innovative technologies. Those were our main conclusions. I hope the presentation was useful. My email address is at the bottom of the slide there. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.